And I'm very pleased to introduce Jane Morton, who's come from Darabin to Climate Action now, and Lloyd and I and Liz are in, and Steve, who's here. So there's almost half the people here on Environmental Voice, which is the advisory group to Baw Baw Shire. And we're starting to agitate about getting Baw Baw Shire to declare a climate emergency. So when we saw Jane was coming to Gippsland to give talk at Ben Show, I think, and there was the opportunity to ask her to come and stop here as well. We grasped that, and because I and I'm sure Liz and the others would be particularly keen to hear a bit about the transition for Darabin Council declaring a climate emergency, because there seems there's a few blockers here.
Here or in the council?
Oh, no, in the Baw Baw Shire organisation ship, I suppose. Yeah. Anyway, so welcome Jane, and Jane, thank you.
Okay, so I'll start by introducing myself a little bit more. So yeah, I'm a psychologist still. But 10 years ago I was just a psychologist. I was going along, I suppose, like many people were. Well, a bit more.
Is it a bit more like? Or tell us when you want to
You can keep me in. Yeah. People can see that. Okay, yeah, so 10 years ago I was one of the people back in 2007, 8, 9, thinking we had 100 years. I really wasn't paying attention. I just thought, they're sort of working on it. We've got 100 years. And the style of therapy I was doing was acceptance and commitment therapy, and it's all about let difficult thoughts and feelings come, keep your eye on your values, and use values to make your decision about what you do. And it's what you do that counts. It's not really how you feel, it's what you do. That's what you'll remember afterwards. So that was what I was doing. When I got invited along just to a local presentation, quite reluctantly, I really just thought, why would I bother with this? It's not that urgent. No, it wasn't 2012, it was back about here. But it was just at the point where the Arctic ice was starting to melt faster and faster. And in fact, faster than anybody had predicted. And being a graphic kind of person, just seeing that slope dropping like that, it got my attention. And what got my attention even more was at that stage I got on the mailing list for a book that was being written by David Spratt and Philip Sutton called Climate Code Red. And they'd started out really just writing a submission to the Garneau inquiry, but as they'd investigated the climate science, they had become more and more alarmed, and so they'd turned their submission basically into a book. And I was getting it chapter by chapter, scary chapter by scary chapter. And the thing that made me most alarmed, I think even more than the graph, was hearing from them that behind the scenes, already in 2007, 2008, already behind the scenes, climate scientists were talking to each other and about how frightened they were, and talking about things like, should they buy land in Tasmania, should they buy land in the south of New Zealand, how are they going to keep their kids safe given what was coming. So they already knew that, but very few other people did. So David and Philip were writing this book, which eventually came out with the call for emergency action and a World War II scale mobilisation in 2008, way ahead of its time. But what they were doing was gathering in the opinions of these scientists, which were really not widely known. So, having got more and more involved and more convinced by this science, 5 years ago I acted on my values and quit my paid job. Most of it I still do a bit of private practice, and to work full-time on the climate emergency. And as a psychologist, one of the things that was clear to me is that, like I said, the scientists were saying it was an emergency, but it was not getting through. And partly this was because of a campaign of lies, but partly it was also to do with the way that the message was being put across, or not put across. So I wrote a booklet. It took 1.5 years of pain, someone will testify to. And it was addressing the myth that was prevalent amongst climate campaigners, and still is, even amongst climate scientists, that fear doesn't work. And I literally went to a conference quite recently, a few months ago, on drawdown, on how we draw down some of the excess that's in the atmosphere and stick it back in the ground if we can. And the scientists were talking again amongst themselves in a fairly worried fashion. And I said to them, look, isn't it time to just tell the public that this is an emergency thing? Oh no, fear doesn't work. So this is as recently as last year. So that's why Paul started mentioning the emergency. So there is a campaign of lies. And I mean, sometimes this is referred to as a right-wing campaign, but I mean, probably most of you too. I'm old enough to remember when Conservatives wanted to conserve stuff. You know, they actually set up conservation parks. They were cautious, risk averse. There's nothing about today's right-wing, radical right approach to building coal-fired power stations and so on, despite the risk. There's nothing conservative about that. And in fact, telling lies, which is what we're seeing from the fossil fuel industry and those who support it, there's nothing that's consistent with anyone's values. Right-wingers, you know, don't go around going, oh, I'm proud to be lying. So we've got a campaign obstacle that is lies. We've got scientific reticence. We've got scientists who have been trained quite appropriately to be cautious about stating things, to state all the caveats, and unfortunately also use language that many, many people cannot understand. But for me, I think the place that I felt I could make a difference was really in what I call cherry picking the psychology. There have been books and books and books written about the psychology and how it makes it impossible to give the message, and about how you'll drive people into denial if you tell them the truth. And yet when you look at the research as a whole, it's just not true. If you tell people the truth, actually it activates people. And one of the people who has been trying to tell the truth is this guy, David Wells. If you want to just read a really scary, depressing book that summarises all the terrible things that can happen, it's The Uninhabitable Earth. And he wrote an article in the New York Magazine. He's deputy editor. He's a very respectable, responsible journalist who did a lot of research for this paper. He interviewed quite a number of scientists. I think it might have been 20, a lot of scientists. And he tried to do what they are not very good at doing. He tried to sum up the science in a way that was full of story and image and reached people's gut. And he was very successful. It had 2 million views. It was the most viewed article in the New York Magazine ever. But sure enough, the very next day that it came out, there was a climate scientist, a very eminent one, saying, oh, he's got a couple of things wrong, and anyway, fear doesn't work. Anyway, I was struggling to get this booklet finished, but that spurred me on. And fortunately, you know, David Wells has really kept on as one of the journalists in the world, really trying to do his best on this. And his rationale is that there's actually much more risk of not scaring people enough at this point than there is of scaring them too much. And that if there's I don't know if you can read that, if there's a 1% chance we've set off a chain reaction that could end the human race, then that should be something that the public knows and thinks about. Yeah, he started off his article with, it doesn't matter how scared you are, you're probably not scared enough. Something like that. Okay, so look, I'm not going to take you all through the psychology research because there's a couple of ways of looking at it that I think summarise the research. If you think of every single public health campaign that is running at the moment, they all have the same format. Tell the public the threat and tell them what to do about it. Cigarette packets. Think of the scary images that the tobacco industry has fought so hard to keep off those. If you smoke, you could get cancer and die, but you could quit. If you share needles, you could get AIDS, go use a needle exchange. If you speed through the suburbs, you could run down a young girl, slow down. They all have the same format. Why? Because it works. And seatbelts, yes, like we could name 10, I think, between us. And look, there's not even any research on this because it is so blindingly obvious. If a fire is approaching your lawn, you don't hear people going, oh, we better not tell people because they might be afraid. Seriously, imagine that. Imagine if the fire chief was going, oh, look, this is one of the ones, you know, where you shouldn't stay and defend, you need to evacuate immediately. Well, we better not tell people, it might make them afraid. You see, there's no research on this because people feel, like you say, we just laugh. Well, I mean, some of that research on climate, you know, it was sort of okay when we didn't think, like, you know, 10 years ago, mostly we didn't really think it was an emergency. Now we know it's an emergency. It makes no sense for any other kind of message except tell people how bad it is, tell them what to do. So, it's time to tell the truth. Now, the first thing that everyone can do is stop saying climate change. That was an idea that an advisor to the Republicans in America came up with because he knew that people found climate change less scary than global warming. So he advised the Republicans to use climate change. And we use it too. And every time we open our mouths and go, climate change, we're advertising the denier meme, the climate is always changing. Why would we do that? Okay, so I recommend emergency. And look, if you call it an emergency, you're in good company. I'll show you a few in a minute. What we need, this is just a little bit of psychology more, is to shift what's called the Overton window. So in between the unthinkable extreme on one side and the unthinkable extreme on the other side on any policy is the sensible centre, and that's where policy is made. Now, our opponents have been so much better at us than giving a really extreme message. They go, it's a hoax, it's a hoax, it's a Chinese hoax, the climate's always changing, the scientists are lying, and they stick to that over and over again. They say it strong, they say it loud, they say it repetitively, they say it intensely. And we, instead of going climate emergency, climate emergency, climate emergency, we come down here and we go, oh, it's real. Oh, it's real. There's actually still a hashtag, climate change is real. So we managed to get the debate right down here, real, not real, real, not real. That's our mistake. If we had 10 years ago gone, declare an emergency, declare an emergency, declare an emergency, we would have shifted policy up that way much faster. Fortunately, it is shifting now. It's partly because people are shifting their language. So here are some of the people that have been trying to shift the language or have been shifting the language over the last 10 years. Ban Ki-moon from the UN, he was using it back in 2007. It's not like there weren't a few at least saying it. One of the first times the Age used it was actually in 2011, but not so often since, just once recently. There you go. And scientists, of course, have been using it. It's more recent. Naomi Klein, more recently, and Peter Garrett. And look, an important thing is that Bill Shorten actually has used that language too. Again, not very often. This was criticising Malcolm Turnbull for being a hypocrite and saying that what about people who know better, yet are ignoring the emergency in front of us. He was talking about Malcolm at that point. Now, one of the campaigns we run in Darwin, I will come to the council later on, but every time there's an election, we get every candidate we can lay our hands on to pledge to support the declaration of a climate emergency. And there's a little thing we get them to hold, saying, I support the declaration of a climate emergency, I'll do everything I can if I'm elected. And when there was a very close by-election between Labor and the Greens in our area, between Jed Carney and Alex Patel, Jed Carney agreed to support the declaration of a climate emergency. And of course, you know, sometimes people just do that because they're in a marginal seat. But we've had long conversations with her and many conversations with her. And she actually did use climate emergency in her maiden speech. She's made some quite strong speeches since then. And that booklet that is up the back, she actually handed that out to the whole of Labor shadow cabinet. So that was amazing. And she helped me go around the back of the offices in Parliament, where you've got to have someone to mind you, or else the security guard shuts you out, talking to people. So she has actually stood by her pledge. And this is her actually at the ALP Federal Conference, moving a motion which is not about declaring a climate emergency, but at least indicates that we are experiencing a climate emergency. And that got through ALP Federal Conference. So there's still people saying, you know, oh, we better go and lobby our Labor person to stop Adani. Well, no, They've already agreed there's a climate emergency. Why not go a bit harder than that? So, apart from just saying climate emergency instead of climate change, how do you tell people about the threat? The thing with 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees is, you know, probably you all think that 1.5 or 2 degrees is really serious, but just about nobody else does, you know. It's a difference of 5 or 10 degrees between night and day, 20 or 30 degrees between summer and winter. So what difference can 2 degrees make? Well, we might know, but it's not an evocative message. So much more powerful, much more visceral is just the idea that the Earth is already too hot. And pretty much anyone you talk to will agree the Earth's already too hot. There's tons of things that we all know to suggest that it is too hot. What does that mean for our carbon budget? Like, you still hear people saying our remaining carbon budget for 1.5. If the Earth's already too hot, what's our carbon budget?
Zero.
It's zero. We're overdrawn, right? It's already too hot. We've got to stop putting more in, and we've got to start taking some out of the air. Or else, how's it ever going to get cooler? You can't keep on just making it a bit more hot, a bit more hot, a bit more hot, and hope that's going to be okay. And every time you say our remaining carbon budget is something, you're saying, well, we can just keep on making it a bit hotter. So, in some ways this is of course terrible news, but it does simplify the message, because you don't have to worry about carbon budgets anymore, or temperatures, because it's too hot, we've got to make it cooler. Another really simple but sort of difficult thing that follows from that is that everything we burn from now on is part of what we're going to have to eventually suck down again. What goes up must go down, must come back down again. So all this stuff about, you know, zero by 2050 as carbon budget for less than 1.5. This is a great quote from Kevin Anderson, a very eminent scientist in the UK. And he's talking about how the IPCC produced its models to somehow end up with this idea that we've got a carbon budget remaining for 1.5. And what they do, of course, which you may already know, is that they assume massive drawdown in the second half of the century, and they assume we don't pass any tipping points before then. So we're going to sort of overshoot, and then we're going to it all back down in the second half of the century, using either massive reforestation, like massive, or bioenergy carbon capture and storage, where you grow stuff, you burn it, you catch the CO2, you truck it to some place where there's a hole, and you stick it back under the ground. Massive amounts, like thousands and thousands of these stations, all. But that's if we don't pass any tipping points, I think. So yes, Kevin Anderson says it's pantomime season and the world has just gambled its future on the appearance in a puff of smoke of a carbon-sucking fairy godmother. That's his opinion. So, like lots of people, again in the climate movement, are going, oh, we've got 12 years to something, something, something. Most people don't really know what we've got 12 years to do. If we're already too hot, do we have 12 years? We don't have any time. As soon as you say to a politician, we've got 12 years to blah, 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 something, the politician goes, great, that's 11 years, I don't have to do anything. It's a terrible message. So, much more effective in terms of moving on from the first message, the Earth's too hot, is that we're running out of time. Now, if you're paddling down a river, it might be all nice. You go around the curve and there's a bit of a noise, the current seems to be going faster, you go around another curve, oh, whoopsie, there's a waterfall up ahead. If you paddle hard for the bank, you might still make it. But you're going to go, oh, I've got 12 minutes or I've got 12 seconds before I start paddling? No, you don't know if you can make it. Start paddling now, or else we'll be over the waterfall. So the waterfall looks something like this. We're already going down the hill. We're already at the point where the Earth could easily keep warming, but it's not very steep yet. We can probably push that back up the hill. If we let it get to 2 or 3, it's just about in free fall. We're not going to push that momentum, the warming in the system, back up the hill if we leave it a bit longer. Now, people always want to know sort of where are those tipping points. Well, the thing with tipping points is you mostly can't be really sure about them until it's too late. So, like in this picture, you've got the big boulder and the little tiny tree, right? It's holding it. It's pretty sure that's going to give way one day, but we don't really know whether it's today, tomorrow, in an hour, or in a year. It's like that with many of the tipping points, especially the cascades of tipping points. We don't really know how they're going to go off. We know they're going to tip each other off, but we don't really know whether it's right now or where exactly it is. And as Ronnie Thompson, again, an eminent paleoclimatologist, said, global warming is a very, very large boulder. We don't know quite where, well, he was saying we don't know quite where the tipping point for runaway change is, but once it goes, it's a very big boulder. So I won't run you through all the depressing news about tipping points, but the fact is we're doing damage, we're changing things that we have no idea how to reverse. And a really major one is that we're slowing the ocean currents. And this was something, again, that Stefan Ramsdorff said we really shouldn't do. And we don't know how to reverse it. Now, this is scientists trying to tell us. They've introduced a new risk category called existential, right? So I did a little informal poll of university-educated people visiting the house, and I said to them, what does existential mean? And I think it was actually 10 out of 10, I'm not sure it was 10 or 9, said, oh, is it something to do with existentialism? It's not a great term, unless you actually explain it. Existential means a threat to human civilization, where most likely human civilization breaks down and most likely most people die. They're trying to say most people could die here, but they're calling it existential, which is a word that most people don't understand. It's worse than catastrophic. Like, catastrophic people do understand. This is a very complicated diagram, but I do love it, partly because of, this is in a scientific paper, and it's got those risk categories, including that new one. But the other important thing about it, even though it's sort of conceptually complicated, is that what that green line is saying is that there's a high probability, it's not a high temperature, it's a high probability, that if we pull 3 levers, we can stay under 1.5 degrees of warming. Do come down the front. That's good. Okay, so we've got to pull 3 levers. The 3 levers to have a good chance of staying under 1.5 is we've got to get to 0 carbon dioxide emissions at emergency speed. We've got to massively and quickly reduce the short-term pollutants like black soot, methane and hydrofluorocarbons, and we've got to do drawdown all at the same time. That's what we've got to do. If we just make moderate reductions or hardly reduce things at all, especially by the time you consider feedbacks, we're heading somewhere between catastrophic and existential, as in most people die. So, like I said, it's not the meaning of life, it's the existence of life. So, in that book up the back, David Spratt's What Lies Beneath, the introduction is by a very eminent scientist, Professor Hans Schullenhuber, and he is the former head of the Potsdam Institute. Now he's the former head, possibly frees him up to speak more frankly, and he says that we're at the end game, reaching the end game, where look, he's been saying it for a while in various ways.
4 degrees and all.
That's right. Yeah. Yes, he has been saying it. Anyway, he said it again in 2018 in the forward. So we've got to choose between unprecedented action or accepting it's been left too late. And again, this is another very important but relatively recent paper, saying that we could trigger a cascade of feedbacks in at under 1.5 or between 1.5 to 2 degrees. We could, like hopefully we won't, because it's going to be jolly hard to stay under those levels of warming. But I think if you take those two together, it's quite obvious we've got no time, and that it is an emergency. I feel quite convinced that's the only way to talk about it. This is a more complicated version of that waterfall illustration, basically saying that we're sort of heading towards the tipping point where we won't be able to go back, but if we work hard, we can go back up the hill and be safe. So that's from the Will Stefan paper. So, the Earth's already too hot and time's running out. It's not just corals that are dying. We're actually losing biodiversity, all sorts of creatures, for all sorts of reasons, partly climate, but partly just all the other terrible things we're doing, including this cute little mammal, sadly. And I suppose you've heard about the insect apocalypse?
Yes.
Yes. I'm going to take my watch off so I can watch the time, because I promised the doom and gloom actually only lasts half. So we're going to go back up the optimism hill in a minute. Okay. So look, it's killing insects, it's killing animals, but it actually is killing humans, and we don't hear as much about it as we should. There's been heat waves recently in Europe where tens of thousands of people have died. You know, just imagine if terrorists killed 10,000 people all in a day or two. Just imagine the headlines. And yet there's enormous numbers of deaths, particularly in Europe, happen, and we hardly see it. You wouldn't really know. So, some people say we're heading for the sixth mass extinction, and the most recent one took 10 million years to recover from on land and 2 million in the ocean. So, look, you know, if we can avoid going right down that path, I think it'd be a fine idea. Could humans become extinct? Well, probably not, hopefully not, but we could lose a lot. And one of the things that we see, again, which some people say, oh, you mustn't talk about that, is we're already seeing conflicts and mass migration starting because of food and water shortages. It's probably one of the most, well, the strongest human-related effects that we're already seeing. And yet we're told, oh, don't mention that because it might make people right-wing. But my thought is that if people know that this is a risk of actually wiping out human civilization, this is not something that makes people right-wing. It's something that unites right, left and centre across the spectrum, because nobody wants human civilization to break down and most people to die. Again, like it hasn't received probably the amount of coverage that you would think it might. India has already built a wall right around Bangladesh because Bangladesh is going under with the sea level rise and they're running out of arable land. They've got 80,000 troops on that border wall, and I think in 1 year they shot 800 going over. Again, you know, imagine if terrorists did 800. So again, this is Lonnie Thompson back from 2010, as you say, so people have been warning of this for a long time. And this is a quote saying, you know, we're pretty moderate and mild-mannered people, so why then are we speaking about the dangers of global warming? The answer is virtually all of us are now convinced that global warming poses a clear and present danger to civilization. That's from 2010. And this is Kevin Anderson. And look, there's varying. It's very hard to calculate exactly how many will survive. We don't know. But we do know that there's a risk that a very large number of people will die if we go down the path, if we keep going. So, look, I followed the scientists' advice. I actually went down to Tasmania and started looking around for land. You know, I thought, well, you know, we can grow our little organic veggies and, you know, it'll be a nice place to retreat to. Until someone said, well, are you giving your kids machine gun lessons too? Because if civilization breaks down, no one's going to care you've got a title to your land in Tasmania. Anyway, hopefully we don't need that. And we are just about to move on to what we're going to do. But what I might do now is just pause for 2 or 3 minutes and get you to talk to somebody near you and just process this bit. Like, is this stuff you already knew? Like, I know you're from the Baw Baw Sustainability Group. I don't know whether you've had talks like this before. Did you already know this? And whether you did or whether you didn't, how do you feel about this? Just for a few minutes, just choose a little group of 1 or 2 near you. This is all old news. The second day, right? Old news, okay, just waiting for the next bit. Oh, okay. So you were getting all this stuff from way back when as catastrophic use. No, I'd like to see other species stay with us as well. You Twice if you can hear me. That's 3 times if you're ready to go. Beautiful.